So let's start the assignment, and let's start by spinning up a NodeJS server. For that, I'll create a new file. You can name it however you want. I will name it app.js. Now, in that file, I want to spin up a new Node.js server, and for that, we need to import the HTTP core module. We do this by creating a new constant, which you can name however you want, but I will stick to HTTP because I'm importing the HTTP core module. Now, HTTP allows me to create a new server by calling the createServer method. And as you learned, the createServer method takes a function which will be executed for every incoming request. Therefore, we get the request here and also this response object, which we can use to return a response. Now, I also want to start my server, and for that, I'll store the returned value of createServer, which will be the server I set up here, in my server constant, and then we can call server listen and listen on port 3000, and by default, this will use our local machine, localhost. Now, this is the first assignment or the first task solved. Now we should handle two different routes, / and /users. And for this, let's go into our function here and parse the URL by accessing request URL. And this will be whatever the user entered after localhost 3000. Now here, let's check if URL is equal to just /. And if that is the case, we want to do something. Let's also check for the other case that we have /users.
Nhiều máy khoan, máy xếp bu lông toàn những hàng chất lượng cao và mẫu mã thì rất là đẹp.
Đây là here if neither of the two is the case, but I will not do that. As a bonus task, you could do that though. Simply send a HTML response with some page not found text, for example. But again, this is something you don't have to do here. It will basically not differ from the other response we're sending though. So let's go to the first if block here, and let's send a response where I set a header first of all and tell the browser that I will send some HTML code by setting the content type to text/HTML. Then we have to write our response, and there I will again create a HTML document. So you can put this all into one write statement, by the way. You don't have to split that up, but I will do it to make it a bit more readable. So I will write my different pieces of the HTML code here. Head, and let's close head here. Assignment 1. And here I'll send the body. So here, let's create the body of our HTML page. And in there, just some dummy text as I wrote. So maybe a paragraph. Welcome to my page. The styling will still not be beautiful, to be honest, but for now it'll do. And then we can end here. Now, here already is one thing you should think about. Do you need to return here or not? Well, it depends. If you got no other code after this code, and this if statement doesn't count because you can't execute the code in there if you make it into this, because the URL is either / or that, and it doesn't matter that this if statement executes, you just must not call any other res methods, and that can't happen if you only have them in this if statement. But if you do have some res write code and so on here, outside of all the if statements, so therefore in a place that will execute, well, in that case, you should return. So it's not required if you don't have it, so right now it would not be required, but it also doesn't hurt if we add it. Now let's copy that to also return some response for /users, and there I want to return an unordered list, so I will simply create an unordered list here with some list items, user 1, let's maybe add a second one, user 2. Okay, so with that, we got the two different routes. Let's now see this in action by running our code with node app.js. Make sure to save your file before doing that, of course. Let's now go to the browser and enter localhost 3000/nothing. You should see welcome to my page because this is what we do render for slash. Let's now enter /users. So let's go there, /users, and we see our unordered list. So this is working, and that is task number 2 solved. We got the route set up. Let's now add that form to the slash page instead of that text here, so that we can send a post request when we click the button that will be part of that form. So here, let's open and close a form tag. And in there, I want to have an input. Type should be text, let's say, and the name should be username as per the assignment. And thereafter, let's also add a button still inside of the form tags. That is important. You can give it any caption you want. I will just write send here, and I will set the type equal to submit, because this will then submit the request that is generated automatically by the form. So on that form here, let's now register an action, which is basically the URL which will be targeted by the auto-generated request. And let's target create-user. And we also need to set a method, because it has to be, or it should be, a post request. So method is equal to post. By the way, you can also write this all lowercase. The casing doesn't matter. So now we have that form with that input and that button. And now we should send a request to that URL. And right now, this should fail, because we'll neither make it into this if statement nor in this if statement, and therefore, since we have no default response, we'll basically let this request die without ever sending a response. So eventually our browser will wait for the response and time out at some point. Not that great of a user experience. We'll of course also learn how to handle 404 not found error cases and so on later in the course. For now, let's simply add a new if check where we see if the URL is equal to /create-user. So basically the route we're targeting here. And in there, we now should simply parse the incoming request data and log it to the console. Now, parsing the request data has to do with that stream and buffer thing, if you remember. For that, we should create an array where we basically store the chunks as they're coming in. And then we register callbacks, or events to be precise. On the request object, we register the data event, and we'll also then need the end event. But let's work on this step by step. Let's start with the data event. Here, the second argument is the function that should be executed for every new piece of incoming data. So for every chunk of data Node.js gives us. I want to add that to my body array. With the push method, I can add that chunk so that I have an array of buffered chunks. Still not something I can work with, or I want to work with. I need a combination of all the chunks in one big buffer, and that buffer, or that array of buffered chunks, should then be turned into a string. So it should basically be translated into text, you could say, which will work here because I know that the request data I get is just text. So we do that in request end, or in the end event. In this callback, we know that all the data has been read and therefore has been added to our body array. And therefore, we can now create our parsed body constant. You could, of course, name it differently. And take our body and create a new buffer based on that. With concat, we can basically create one buffer of all these chunks, which are buffers themselves. So now we take our body and create one buffer of all the chunks, and we call toString here. So this will basically convert this to a string value. And now we can console log this, but I want to actually just log the value the user sent. So I will not log username equals whatever the user entered. This would be what we right now get out of this, because this is how this will be stored. Username is simply the key which we'll have, because we chose username as a name for the input. So instead, just as before, I will actually use a built-in JavaScript function and take my parsed body, which is a string, to split it on the equal sign into two strings, therefore, stored in an array. And an array starts with the index 0. That would be the left side of the equal sign, the username. I'm interested in the right side, so I will use index 1, which is just the second element in the array. First element is the username, the key. Second element is the value. So I will log that. And of course, I also want to send a response here so that we don't get stuck. I want to redirect. And for this, I set a status code of 302, which is basically a I redirected you status code. And then here I will set a header telling the browser where to redirect to by setting the location header and setting it to just /. And thereafter, let's call end to indicate that we're done. With that, we should be able to load the / route, see that form, enter a value, hit the button, reach that URL on our server, see that being logged here in this terminal, and then be redirected. So let's quit the process and restart, which you always need to do after making changes. Let's go back to just /, because this is where I added the form. Does this work is what I want to output. Hit send, and I'm getting redirected. This is looking good. And on the server, we see that output. Still with these extra characters. Again, that is something we'll handle or let handle later. But this works, and this is the entire assignment solved for now.